Rolling. Hey, Scott.
Hey, Mark.
Hey, so this is Mark Goldberg with the UN Affairs blog UN Dispatch, talking to Scott Paul, who is a contributor to the Washington Note and also works in government relations at the Citizens for Global Solutions. Scott, I guess maybe you want to tell us a bit about what Citizens for Global Solutions is, so we get.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Citizens for Global Solutions is a nationwide membership organization. Our members all believe that the U.S. is strongest when we work together with other countries to solve global problems, and that that sort of problem solving is most beneficial to U.S. foreign policy and U.S. influence, and also gets the most done to solve global problems. So that takes us all over the gamut on issues ranging from international law and justice, where we work on a lot of international criminal court related issues and torture and prisoner and detention related issues, to peace and security, to energy and climate change, and a host of other related problems that we're dealing with at the moment.
Yeah. So I think it's fair to say that you and I probably come from similar perspectives on these issues. But sort of I think you, as opposed to I, have a bit more of a sort of sophisticated knowledge of a lot of sort of the ins and outs of how these issues play in Congress, because sort of that's what you do as your day job. And I think it might be interesting to talk a little bit about sort of how a lot of these issues sort of go to Congress, oftentimes to die. I think maybe a good entry point and a good case study we can talk about is something I know you focus on very closely, which is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Why don't you tell us a bit about what that is?
Well, I'll pretend that you're not insinuating that the Law of the Sea Convention is going to die.
No, well, we'll talk about that later. But I think I have my pessimistic take. But go on.
Sure. The Law of the Sea Convention is a treaty that regulates use of the world's oceans. It's a treaty that's been developed since the late 60s and early 70s. Every president since then has advocated for such a treaty. Negotiations were finalized in 1982, and at that point, Ronald Reagan, who was president at the time, said the majority of this treaty is in our balance of interests. The balance of interests of the treaty works for the United States, but because of problems with the seabed mining provisions, the U.S. could not sign or ratify the treaty. A bunch of years went by, and under President Bush, the state parties to the treaty actually came back to the United States and said, it's really important that we renegotiate these seabed mining provisions so we can get the United States into the treaty. The first Bush administration was very excited about that because the rest of the treaty was essentially negotiated to meet a bunch of U.S. concerns that previous oceans treaties hadn't. So through the Bush administration, through Bush 1, we worked out a series of new understandings and a new agreement on deep seabed mining, and that agreement was then signed under the Clinton administration in 1994. Mm-hmm. This is a treaty that benefits U.S. national security by guaranteeing the rights and freedoms that our military has to navigate and fly over the seas. Particularly important in archipelagos and in straits, which, without any sort of international understandings, could be choke points. We navigate those now with an understanding that we have the right to do so, but those rights are only enshrined for us in customary international law, since the Law of the Sea is considered a treaty among parties. There are a number of countries that do not recognize our rights under international law to do so. We saw some of that, at least in the aftermath of the confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz last week.
Yeah.
It also benefits us economically. All major ocean industries that are affected by the Law of the Sea Convention are in favor of U.S. ratification of the treaty. And that ranges from shipping to fishing to undersea cables in the telecom industry to, most importantly, mining and oil and gas industry. The treaty would essentially give us exclusive economic control of an area that extends 200 miles past our shores. And then beyond that, any additional territory that would be considered an extension of our continental shelf. And without the legal surety that the treaty would give us, no oil company and no gas company will drill in any area that doesn't have some sort of international recognition because they can't get the investment to do the project.
Yeah.
They need that legal surety to go forward. And that's a multi-million, if not billion-dollar industry coming up in the next few years and decades.
So just to recap, sorry, you're saying that the oil industry wants this, and the sort of military is supportive of this.
And the amazing thing about this too is that you have the oil industry and the military folks, and we're sitting at the table. We're seen often as a peace and security group. We work with the military on some issues, but we like to prevent wars. More often than not, as do some of our allies in the NGO community. And then the environmental groups are there too because they see the law of the sea as the single best leverage that the United States has in getting other countries to fulfill their international obligations to protect the oceans and protect marine ecosystems. Mm-hmm. Now, the U.S. is already fully in compliance with every part of the law of the sea. That happened under the Reagan administration. He essentially said all U.S. agencies have to be in full compliance. And then Congress has, over the past decade or so, brought us up to date with all of those provisions. So we're following the rules. We're just not claiming our rights and responsibilities and asserting our influence. And that's a big part of why the environmental community wants to see us there, not because the law of the sea would force us to do anything we're not already doing, but because the U.S. already has pretty strong ocean protection laws, and it would do very, very well for ourselves and for the world's oceans, for us to be at the table working with other countries to see that other countries have the same sort of protections.
So I guess the question is, you have all these sort of stakeholders from various constituencies, supporting this. Yet I remain pessimistic, and I think I'm pessimistic because we just haven't seen much movement on this issue, even though. It's sort of been sitting there on Congress's lap for how long now? Actually, Scott, that's a good question.
Well, President Bush, President Clinton signed the treaty in 1994.
Okay.
It was first brought into Congress this time around in 2003. There is no bigger champion anywhere in the United States than Senator Dick Lugar, who was chairman of the committee, the Foreign Relations Committee then. At that point, he got a unanimous vote out of the Foreign Relations Committee in favor of the treaty. And then Bill Frist prevented it from ever going to the floor. So this time around,
do you know sort of why that might have been the case?
Politics, purely politics. There are a couple of fringe groups in D.C. who simply don't believe that any international multilateral agreement can be to the advantage of the United States, can work in U.S. interests. And frankly, a lot of the reason I'd like to see us as part of the treaty is to start to beat down that myth. That the U.S. is weaker when we agree to follow the same rules as everybody else.
Why don't you name names and sort of talk about what some of these groups were doing?
Sure. The cheerleader in chief here is Frank Gaffney, who has a weekly column in the Washington Times.
Yeah.
His preference would be he considers himself a national security specialist.
Right.
So his preference would be to see the U.S. maintain our rights and assert our influence exclusively by force.
Okay.
He actually and some of his allies see the Law of the Sea Convention as a constraint on the United States, in part because he thinks it would limit what we can and can't do, which is false, but also because it would have us turn to law instead of force to assert our influence, which is true. And that's something the Navy is very strong on. The Navy wants very, very badly to see us use law rather than the threat of force to assert our influence around the world. They don't want us to be monitoring every oil rig and every strait with gunships. We want to be able to rely on international law to guarantee those rights of navigation and our economic rights.
I guess sort of my question then, you have what you call a fringe group there, the Frank Gaffney's outfit who is opposing this, but yet on the other side you have sort of other sort of natural constituencies of the Republican Party, the oil companies, the mineral extraction companies, who are very supportive of this. It seems sort of, I guess, how did sort of Frank Gaffney win Bill Frist's ear as opposed to the oil industry associations?
Frank Gaffney has some allies with a bunch of grassroots groups. Number one, and they have proven very effective in getting their message out. They actually did that when they foiled the Convention on Biological Diversity in the 90s. They've proven very, very effective at stymieing treaty ratification in the Senate. It's at this point a very well-established network. And the reason, actually, that the Law of the Sea is so important, or one of the many reasons, is it's the easiest one to pass. There are those natural constituencies in the Republican Party to push back against a lot of those grassroots groups who are organized to block treaty ratifications. So it follows, if you can't do this one, what treaty can you get through? The other thing that Frank Gaffney has working for him that the rest of us don't is a flexibility to play with the truth, to put it bluntly. And
that actually wasn't very blunt. Why don't you just go out and say it?
Sure. He writes lies in the Washington Post. I'm not afraid to say that. Sorry, the Washington Times. Mm-hmm. And on a weekly basis, he finds a different false interpretation of the treaty to illustrate how the treaty could somehow damage our economic or national security. And each week it is either it's always wrong, and it's often impossible to understand how it could be a mistake in good faith. Yeah. So these deliberate misunderstandings have managed to find their way into public discourse, and then public discourse has then put them into the Senate. And a lot of the reason we have problems getting this treaty through is it's become about politics and not substance. I've visited something around 25 to 30 Senate offices. There have been somewhere around 5 that have raised serious substantive concerns, and those 5 at the end of the meeting have come away with some sort of richer understanding that, in fact, they had been fed some sort of mischaracterization of the treaty or misinterpretation, but that does not guarantee positive votes. At this point, everyone is saying, we understand where you're coming from, we understand why this would work, but we listen to our constituents, and that's sort of code for the opponents are yelling louder than supporters, and we need to respect that.
So are you saying then that sort of senators who thought were once favoring ratifying the Convention on the Law of the Sea are sort of flipping? Are you seeing that at all?
Absolutely. Okay. That has happened sometimes. The most obvious example, and you may have seen some of this, Mark, is John McCain's flip.
Okay.
And I don't know if it's a flip or if it's a pander or if it's a temporary flip, but here's a guy who has a long history of support of the treaty. He's pushed for it since the early 90s for U.S. accession to the treaty. In the late 90s, he signed a letter to the Foreign Relations Committee and copied the Senate saying we need to get this moving. He was scheduled to testify on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 2003, and then since he couldn't make it, he included written testimony in the committee report suggesting that this is a vital tool for U.S. national security and that we really need to get on board quickly. So here's a guy with a long history of support. Mm-hmm. Then he's on a bloggers conference call sometime in the fall, and he's asked about the treaty. And every other Republican candidate at that point had sort of said, it's no good, it's bad, it's a problem, sovereignty this, sovereignty that. And he said something like, I have some serious concerns. We need a Law of the Sea Convention, but I probably wouldn't vote for it in its present form. Left himself a lot of wiggle room, but I mean, there's not much more transparent a pander so far in this presidential race.
Yeah, I mean, I guess he doesn't. I guess what it boils down to is he doesn't sort of win any votes for supporting it. But he certainly could lose votes for supporting it.
Sure.
Frank Gaffney sort of America First kind of crowd.
Sure. I mean, there's very little political gain for voting for this treaty, and we've butted up against that very, very hard. So,
what's sort of the current state of play then of the treaty? Is my sort of pessimism, do you think, warranted?
Yeah, to some extent. I still think we have a pretty good chance of doing it, but I would understand why someone would be pessimistic.
Yeah.
Senator Reid obviously is going to want to know that he has the votes to get this passed before he puts this on the floor. Even at that, he has to be willing to plan at least a few days at minimum to deal with the procedural hurdles that people like Senator Inhofe are going to throw up. But he wants to have the votes there, and bluntly, we're not going to. He probably has the votes right now to do it. If you put it on the floor.
Sorry, just to be clear, it's a treaty, so it's like 2/3, if I remember from high school civics class.
2/3 of those voting are present. So
yes.
let's say there's going to be a couple of senators that are on the campaign trail and don't show up. We're looking something like 65 senators.
Okay.
So, and he probably has it, to tell you the truth. But he's not going to know he has it until President Bush says something more forceful than he has yet. And presidential involvement in treaty passage has historically been pretty much, absolutely necessary. No way of getting around it.
Yeah.
Every treaty that was passed under the Clinton administration, every major multilateral treaty, required the president's serious involvement. We know the president supports the convention. He's told the conservatives straight up, look, this is good for us. We need to be at the table. We know that the people around him are strongly supportive of it.
Yeah.
The main issue is there's a couple of people in the White House who think that it's bad politics, and that at some point later there's going to be some legislative issue that the president's going to need conservatives for. And for some reason, and I'm really not sure why they believe this, for some reason they think that his advocacy for the law of the sea is going to hurt his influence with conservatives later in the administration. And there's not a whole lot of time left. Can you think of any where is this going to hurt him?
It's hard. It's hard for me to think that through. It doesn't seem like there's just not a tremendous amount of issues left for him to try to push. Most of what he tried so far he's failed. So you made a point earlier that was interesting. You said that sort of this. You were saying essentially that with all these stakeholders coming together from these various constituencies, that is making sort of the law of the sea kind of low-hanging fruit. And if sort of we can't sort of grab that, then sort of all sorts of other similar treaties and similar issues coming before Congress stand a much more difficult time of being heard and being passed. What other sort of issues are you looking at down the road?
Well, I mean, for one thing, the obvious ones that are already sort of in play, but not being moved at the moment. You've got the convention on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which I think people are going to want to push if there's
what's the state of play of that?
There was an attempt at it in the 90s. It didn't go anywhere. There's a question as to whether or not the votes are there for it.
Yeah.
Presumably, with a more progressive Senate and a more progressive president, there would be a shot at it. But treaty. I mean, if the last 15 years have taught the Senate anything, it's that ratifying treaties takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of votes, and it takes a lot of aggravation, and it usually is harder to do than other legislative business.
Yeah.
And if you start out with 68 votes and you need 67, and the conservative network sort of ramps up their activism, you're probably not going to finish with 67.
Yeah.
So here's the Law of the Sea Convention. This is supposed to be the the low-hanging fruit, if you will.
Right.
And so part of why this is so important is if you can't do this, it further entrenches that conventional wisdom that you can't do treaties in the Senate. If you can do it, suddenly people look at treaties again and say, well, there's actually some really good policy we can move through the Senate, and now that we can get treaties through, and oh my God, it's the day after, and national sovereignty hasn't evaporated.
Right.
Then maybe the door opens a little wider. So there's the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is one. Another is the Convention on Biological Diversity, which, as I mentioned, was shot down in the 90s.
What is that exactly?
It's a treaty that protects endangered species and biological diversity around the planet. I'm not an expert on the treaty, but it's President Clinton was strongly supportive and got pretty close to getting it through. It got floor time in the 90s, but the network generated a whole lot of faxes, and that was that. Mm-hmm. And then the other one, which is sort of the elephant in the room at the moment, is what will probably be called the Copenhagen Protocol.
Sorry, I didn't explain. Yes.
So in Bali, just a couple of months ago, or a month and a half ago or so, governments agreed to negotiate a second commitment period on climate change for reducing emissions.
So this is basically like a Kyoto successor treaty.
Yeah. Mark, were you there in Bali?
I was not. But we had a fancy blog edition on UN Dispatch where we had folks who were in Bali giving us updates in real time. And so I felt like I was there, but most of the time I was in my living room.
Right. And were you at the General Assembly session?
I was, and it was really interesting to see folks like Schwarzenegger and Al Gore come and chat up and have Ban Ki-moon just convene everyone to make this a priority issue. Yeah.
Ban has put in a tremendous amount of work on this and really.
Well, that's I mean, this is something I've talked about with some of the other guests I've had on. We've talked about sort of what Ban Ki-moon is all about. It seems to me that he is making climate change a signature issue. That sort of in ways that Kofi Annan made human rights a signature issue. Ban is he traveled to Antarctica to highlight climate change, and he's putting a lot of his own sort of personal political weight behind Bali. He sort of flew in and stayed in there to make sure the convention occurred, and then he had that General Assembly session that a few weeks prior to Bali to try to build up this political momentum for the treaty, for the conference. So I see him putting a lot of effort into this, and all power to him, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's made a huge difference. The politics on climate change in the U.S. have always, at least in the last couple of years, have shifted a lot and become very favorable to getting something done and to joining and building an agreement. But I was in Montreal in 2005, and it was, once again, pretty much the world versus the United States. Yeah. But the world in that division was sort of was not very aggressive. The U.S. said their piece, and everyone sort of said, well, okay, I guess everyone has their own approaches to this. Yeah. But I think what Ban did, and I guess Al Gore helped to do also, and full credit to citizen activists who've been involved in the grassroots side of this push, is they really got the Europeans in particular to stand up to the U.S. And to make it clear that they know that President Bush isn't going to be around forever, and this policy is changing. And so I remember actually seeing on a video feed that when I think it was Paula Dobriansky got up to speak and explain the U.S. position.
She's the U.S. rep,
Right. She was booed. And ultimately, she ultimately sort of came around and said, yeah, okay, we'll go along. Yeah. Anyway, back to where you were headed originally. The agreement coming out of Bali was over the next 2 years, there will be this sort of Kyoto 2.0 next steps for emissions reduction, and that'll culminate in the 2009 conference in Copenhagen. Interesting. So there's going to be an agreement coming out of there. And if people want to see that even get floor time in the Senate, they're going to want to see the Law of the Sea Convention move, because it's a lot easier to get that through than it is to get something like Copenhagen or Kyoto. I mean, just for perspective, one of the opposition tactics for the Law of the Sea is they're saying this is a backdoor into Kyoto. So just the shadow of Kyoto is helping ramp up opposition to the Law of the Sea. You can imagine what it would be like.
Is Kyoto just like a poison pill? When senators hear Kyoto, they freeze up and they think it's like this giant monster coming to eat the United States and grind out its economy.
Absolutely, it's that thing that the Chinese and Indians did to us. to get a leg up economically. It is not popular in the Senate. And a lot of that, again, does not have to do with substance. It has to do with the fact that this is a treaty. And the conventional wisdom is treaties don't move, and Americans don't like treaties. I mean, you and I know the polling on this, and we know that's not true. And we know that Americans actually want the United States to participate in international agreements where we're expected to do our part of things.
Yeah. But I think I was talking to one of your colleagues, Don Krause, last week, and he made a point saying that most of Americans may be favorably disposed towards things like the UN and global environmental treaties, but the opposition is much more intense with their hostility than the majority is with their support.
They're loud.
Yeah. They're much they're much louder.
And part of that is because most Americans who want us to be a part of this, to be part of international organizations, part of international agreements, think that we are. There's this widespread perception that no matter who's in the White House, no matter who's in Congress, that we're always doing the right thing. It's sort of part of the American psyche to believe that we're doing our part and we're the good guys. And that's in a lot of ways, in a lot of on a lot of issues, that's helped move us to do the right thing. This expectation that we're moral and that we're good citizens in the world. The flip side of that is that on under the radar issues like the law of the sea, most people assume that we are doing the right thing, and most people assume that we are playing by the rules and that we acknowledge the rules and that we are that we recognize this sort of common set of laws that the entire world lives by. And when it's not true, it's hard to get people excited about it.
I guess what's frustrating in a way is that it is this sort of this low-hanging fruit, and if we accede to it, it's a sign to the rest of the world saying America's ready to do business again, where we're ready to engage with you constructively again. But for the reasons you've outlined, I still remain pessimistic that that's going to happen. But under a new administration, even though this administration is supportive of it, under a new administration, it presents sort of new opportunities. And but I guess to get to that new administration, we need to.
I'm skeptical of that, Mark. I don't think so. I think if it's a new administration, if it's a Republican administration, we're going to see no action. Because they've all been boxed in by the opposition to say they don't like it.
But sorry, just to interrupt you. I mean, could a future administration be more obstructive of, say, a global climate change treaty than the current one is?
No,
I think, for example, the reason that Bali was sort of a success was because they agreed to not sort of do anything until 2009, when a new president will be in the White House. They're sort of kind of betting on future cooperation. And even if it's Republican, I don't think that the Republican could be. They could be as obstructionist as the current administration, but they couldn't be more.
You're totally right.
If it's a Democrat, there's real room for progress. My only concern is that sort of looking to the future, if there is a Democratic president, he or she is going to have a lot on their plate. We have Iraq is a huge issue, and healthcare I think is probably going to be the biggest sort of political debate of the next administration if it's a Democrat. And I just don't see room for climate change in there. And I wonder how, if a new president can do climate change and healthcare and Iraq at the same time. It just doesn't seem to me that sort of climate change is going to be the top priority.
I think actually climate change and law of the sea are a little bit different in this respect. I think for law of the sea, Republican administrations aren't going to push it, and Democratic administrations won't be able to give the cover that Republican senators will need to vote for it. So that means basically if the law of the sea doesn't get done in the next year, it's probably not going to get done for 5 or 10 years. But climate change,
are you because you're assuming that neither the next Republican president will be as supportive as Bush, or the next Democratic president just won't have the will to push it through?
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, not so much the will to push it through, the ability to give cover to those moderate senators who might be inclined to vote for it, but need some sort of excuse to fall back on. Here they can say, President Bush, conservative president, is telling me that this is going to make our country safer. Yeah. that doesn't quite have the same ring to it when it comes out of Hillary Clinton's mouth.
Yeah.
For moderate or even conservative red state senators.
Yeah.
Climate change, I think you're totally right, is absolutely going to be very different. But I'm even a little bit more optimistic on climate change than you are if there's a Democrat in the White House, because over the last couple of years, at the grassroots, climate change has become a huge issue. It's become so much part of the base that, this year's primary versus the '04 primaries, it is night and day in terms of the attention that is being paid to climate change. And I don't, with all due respect to Al Gore, I don't think this is his responsibility. I think it's mostly the responsibility of a lot of the grassroots groups, and especially the youth groups that have been organizing coalition style around the country, getting their campuses to take action and switch to renewable energy, getting involved in municipal affairs, getting cities and states to take action. I think this is going to be very hard for a Democrat to ignore. I think it will come up under a Democratic administration. The only question is it going to come up under ambitious domestic legislation?
Right.
Or is someone going to look at the law, the unfinished business of the law of the sea and say, I don't want to push a treaty through. But someone could be brave and try to make Copenhagen an issue. I hope so.
Actually, here's kind of a random question. I heard that a lot of so there's been a succession of these sort of climate change conferences. You said from Montreal to Bali to Copenhagen and Vienna, and I heard that there was some sort of challenge and competition between the cities as who will get to be sort of have their name attached to the next treaty.
Yeah.
How did Copenhagen win this one?
They were slotted for '09, and
okay.
the Bali mandate basically said we're going to finish the agreement by '09, which essentially means that when the high level delegation comes there and there's the ministerial level meeting in Copenhagen, the expectation is that that's where the agreement will come from. I could be totally wrong about that. For all I know, they won't finish it. International negotiations, I think, have moved slow and have a reputation for moving slowly.
Right.
So you know that as well as I do. You've sort of witnessed a lot of that firsthand. They say it's going to be Copenhagen, so presumably it'll be called the Copenhagen Protocol or the Copenhagen Treaty or something.
The Copenhagen Treaty. It doesn't quite roll off the tongue quite as much as Kyoto, but if anyone deserves it, why not the Danes, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Listen, Scott, thank you so much for joining us, and talk to you soon.
Yeah, my pleasure, Mark.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, bye, Scott.
Bye-bye.